Hey everyone, it is Ed Gutowski. Welcome to week 2. And what I wanted to do today is I wanted to create a video in which you talk about the rhetoric and argument part of class. Right? So hey, week 1 was a great success. I love students' comments. I love what you wrote about the poems for class. So now we're going to shift to the rhetoric and argument part of class. So there's a couple of things that you should know. I always like students because students are always so cocky. You all think you know what an argument is, and none of you in here know what an argument is. So before we can talk about argument, the first thing we do is we have to talk about rhetoric. And rhetoric and argument are linked. You can't have one without the other. So before we can start talking about argument, we have to talk about rhetoric. So in a ground class, the first thing I might do is I might ask students, how many students in the class before, say 5 minutes ago, had never heard the term rhetoric? And I get a couple of students who will raise their hands, right? So some students have never heard the term rhetoric. And if that's the case you're in right now, that's fine, because we'll spend this week kind of helping you to understand rhetoric, and then we'll get into more complex definitions. Now, while there are some students who will say, hey, they've never heard the term rhetoric, there are a few students who will say they've heard the term rhetoric, but they don't really know how to define it, right? So we have to help those students out as well. And then there are some students who are cocky and they think they know what rhetoric is. So let's assume that, in this case, that you've never heard the term rhetoric. So let's help those students out first, right? So in that case, what I ask students, how many, is it safe to say we can make the claim that there are people who use rhetoric? And just about everyone will raise their hands. So we know that there are people who use rhetoric. So let's figure out who these people are. Who are the people who use rhetoric? And every time I ask this question, students will always answer with their first response. The people that use rhetoric are politicians. Politicians are always associated with rhetoric. So if you think about it, in the last couple of years, politics has been really ugly in this country, but you probably heard somewhere along the way that Donald Trump is using rhetoric. If you've been paying attention to politics this week, we know the Republicans had a debate, they've had an argument, right? And that you might have heard, Ron DeSantis is using rhetoric, or Mike Pence is using rhetoric. So politicians are always associated with rhetoric. Now, the second group that students can always associate with rhetoric are lawyers. They always say lawyers. And that makes sense, because if you think about it, lawyers are always going to argue a case in court. So it would make sense that they would use rhetoric. So once we can establish, okay, who are the other people that use rhetoric? Politicians use rhetoric. We know lawyers use rhetoric. Who else use rhetoric? Sometimes students associate rhetoric to a specific discipline, so they'll say philosophers use rhetoric. Well, that would make sense because Aristotle, Socrates, Plato are always associated with rhetoric. Students always say, well, English teachers use rhetoric, right? Well, English teachers use rhetoric all the time, right? Well, that means that students also use rhetoric, and sometimes they're not very good at it. So let's just establish that the only thing we know is that there are people who use rhetoric. Politicians, lawyers, philosophers, teachers, and students, right? Then I want to talk about forms of rhetoric. So if I'm in a ground class, I say, okay, well, now I'm going to have a guest speaker who's going to use rhetoric to help us understand rhetoric. So I want you to imagine behind those two computer screens, all of a sudden I have a guest speaker, and behind that one screen, out pumps former President Barack Obama. There he is. Hi, Obama, right? And we know he's a politician. We know he's going to use rhetoric. Well, what is he going to do, right? And so he's standing on my shoulder. What physical action he's doing? And when some students will say, well, he's talking, he's speaking, he's giving a speech. So a form of rhetoric can be a speech. And now Obama's going to disappear. Bye, Obama, right? So politicians generally use speeches when they are giving a form of rhetoric. And I know I may be making an outdated reference with Obama, but I always ask students, well, how many people have seen Obama speak live in person? And sometimes when Obama was president, I would get some students who'd raise their hands. Some students had served in the military, maybe had seen him speak. But I say, well, how is it that you've seen Obama speak but never met him in person? And then students will go, well, TV. So notice a form of rhetoric can be TV. Well, if TV is a form of rhetoric, what else might be a form of rhetoric? Radio, right? The internet, emails could be a form of rhetoric, right? We might think of newspapers as a form of rhetoric, or books. Well, if newspapers and books are a form of rhetoric, the person using that form of rhetoric would be either a journalist or a writer. So I just want you to think, okay, we can have forms of rhetoric as well. So we know there are people who use rhetoric, politicians, lawyers, philosophers. Now we can add writers, English teachers, and students. We know there are forms of rhetoric, whether it be a speech, a TV, the internet, an email, a book, or a magazine. Okay, so I'm now going to give you my definition of rhetoric. And this is how I will define rhetoric. I will define rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and con people. So as we progress, I'm going to define rhetoric as words that are used to manipulate, to deceive, and to con people. And what I want you to do is I want you to think about my definition of rhetoric, kind of think about how I've sort of tried to explain rhetoric with the people who use rhetoric, the forms of rhetoric, and my definition that I'm going to keep, which is words that are used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. And then I want you to watch the 2 videos below. And afterwards, there's a discussion board where I want you to know how based on what you've learned here from this lecture and the 2 other lectures, how you define rhetoric and why. You can agree with me, you can disagree with me, but as of week 2, I'm going to define rhetoric as words used to manipulate, deceive, and con people. And then we'll have something to play with as we kind of progress into week 2 and week 3. If you need anything or have any questions, come by my Zoom office hour on Monday or shoot me an email. But I look forward to seeing how you are going to define rhetoric after this brief lecture and then the 2 other lectures videos below.